My name is Michael Neagle. I am a professor of history and director of history and political science at Nichols College in Dudley, Massachusetts. Um, and we're talking about this is my second book called Chasing Bandits, America's Long War on Terror. And the basic gist of it is to make the case that the 21st century global war on terror is really nothing new in American history. And I make the case with these six case studies that I examine in the book that the United States has been fighting similar enemies for well over a century in the name of national security and also to protect national interests abroad.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, first question that's kind of an easy one. Who is this book for? Who is the target audience? And, what was the purpose of writing the book for that audience?
So this was a book that was inspired by an undergraduate class that I have taught at Nichols since 2014 about the War on Terror. And this book idea kind of stemmed from an initial version of that class, which is trying to historicize the 21st century global war on terror. I have since adapted the class in some different ways, but I thought that I had a book here that was worth pursuing, that was worth researching and spending the time to do. So the main audience for this book is undergraduates. So I wrote that with them in mind. I wrote purposely dramatic narratives in each of these case studies to try to hook readers into these stories, and then they will hopefully see some of the through lines between these. On the surface, these six case studies seem like very disparate cases, but I do make the case in the book that there are through lines connecting them all. So undergraduates were the ones who I had in mind, but I also wrote it in a way that I think a general audience that does not have advanced degrees in history or anything like that should be able to pick up and follow right away. Um, Before I was became a history professor, I was a newspaper reporter. So I'm used to writing for broad general audiences to make things accessible and engaging to as broad an audience as possible. So my hope is that this book does reach not just undergraduates, but also readers who have an interest in American foreign policy, terrorism, military history, and America, modern America. I think the book could be appealing to those kinds of audiences.
That makes sense. I was going to bring that up because each chapter starts with a scene and then there's sort of like an analysis, but then there's scenes all the way through. And I was thinking that that's really helpful, with just understanding the concepts that you're presenting, seeing how they actually played out and being able to imagine the figures. There's also some pictures in the book, which is also nice because, there are descriptions of the characters or the people in the books, but it's also kind of nice to see them. And it really does change the emotional impact, I think, of some of the stories, especially like when you see some of the like images of their deaths, which are not graphic at all, but I think impactful. What made you decide to put those specific pictures in the book?
So I wanted folks who read it to have at least an image, a visual of who these individuals were. So that was number one. Secondly, I also wanted to make sure that there were some maps, so everybody could be situated geographically. Where do these stories take place? So I wanted, and I was also thinking about this again from teaching this as an undergraduate course. If I'm giving a lecture, I want to make sure I have images of the individuals up on the screen so people can have an idea of who I'm talking about, and also where are these stories taking place. So I also had that in mind in selecting these photos to just help ground the reader to have an idea of who we're talking about and where all of these events were taking place.
That makes sense. I really liked the inclusion of the political cartoons here and there too. I thought that was really really nice because a lot of your concepts are really centering on, using these terms, terrorist or bandit, or, sort of dehumanizing terms like calling these folks insects or dogs, and just like what the function of that is for political and I think social purposes. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I feel like that's all the way through your book in every case study.
Yeah, again, in trying to make the case that the global war on terror is not new, one of the things that I do find the connective tissue here between these different case studies is the language, how historical actors described these individuals. So I make the case that the bandit and the savage of the early 20th century is really not much different from the terrorist of the 21st century. If you could put somebody like Osama bin Laden at the turn of the 20th century, he probably wouldn't be called a terrorist. He'd be called a bandit. And also somebody like Pancho Villa, who stages this attack on the United States on Columbus, New Mexico, kills 18 Americans in March 1916. If you could put that episode in the 21st century, Pancho Villa would be called a terrorist. So I think there are these meanings. So the words, the specific words might be a little bit different, but I argue that the meanings are the same over time. And I think this has justified the United States having more of a forceful presence abroad. But it has also enabled the United States to counter these individuals, to to break or bend established rules of warfare, to go after these individuals in and occasionally the brutal ways in which they were done. And so this language is important to justify going after these individuals, to um, to also justify the way in which they would go about pursuing them. And there's also a slippery slope there with some of these terms, bandit and savage. Also leads to an easy dehumanization. And as I have in the book, descriptions of Pancho Villa, for example, who, rightly has the enmity of Americans for staging this attack where he kills 18 Americans. But he's described as an animal, as an insect who has to be exterminated. And so this leads to kind of these attempts, at least, to have these extrajudicial attempts to take out somebody like Pancho Villa and some of the others who I write about in the book.
Yeah, I noticed that discussion. I think it was in one of the earlier chapters, just about using what is the word? Yeah, the previously established rules of engagement. Like just sort of like there are so many quotes where, people in the government or people in the military are saying like, yeah, basically we don't actually have to follow the rules that we've set because we're
Yeah.
just so mad at these people. And it's really interesting how easy that seems to be across time and in all these different situations when it does seem like many, if not all of the people that you focused on did what they did, at least in their own minds, because they were responding to violence that they felt the United States had enacted upon them or their communities. Does that is that correct? Am I getting that
Yeah.
correct?
Oh, yeah, certainly, certainly. And I guess there's a couple aspects of this. I think one, these forms of irregular warfare that individuals like Emilio Aguinaldo in the Philippines conduct, or Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua conduct, they do so not because of some sort of cultural deficiency, but I think they do so more out of practicality to try to push back and mitigate the substantial advantages that the United States had militarily and technologically. And so they stage these guerrilla tactics, hit and run tactics, and so forth to try to mitigate that. And these tactics, though, will then also feed into the notion of banditry and savagery, that will also be important because if these individuals are bandits, savages, or terrorists, they are engaging in a kind of violence that is beyond the pale of acceptable standards of civility. And so these individuals are also seen as uncivil, as illegitimate, and so therefore they are not entitled to the protections of those who engage in civilized, legitimate warfare, basically a violence that is sanctioned by a state. And so if those individuals are not abiding by notions of civility and legitimate ways of warfare, then they are not entitled to protections of international law. And so this justifies the United States or any country that is combating such foes to go outside the bounds of established warfare. And so we see this over and over and over again through the years. The book starts with the Philippines, the use of torture, this tactic of the water cure, which bears incredible hallmarks, I think, to the concept of waterboarding in the 21st century global war on terror, used against people deemed terrorists, unlawful combatants, who are outside the bounds of acceptable forms of violence and warfare. So the terminology also is really important in justifying how the U.S. is going to pursue these individuals.
Yeah, it seems like a really kind of bizarre, awful cycle because I also noticed later, I can't remember which character it was, which person it was, who described like being captured kind of inappropriately captured as a kind of university that just like further radicalized him. And I was just when I read that, I was thinking, it seems like over and over both sides are just like, well, if you're going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and if you're going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and it just keeps going and going
Yeah.
and going. Everything is justified because everything is just violence.
I think you're referring to my concluding chapter. I do have a little bit, kind of a half of a case study about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the ISIS leader, and prior to his joining ISIS, he was caught in essentially in a dragnet while the U.S. is occupying Iraq. He and many other thousands of other Iraqi men were subjected to this as well. They were arrested on suspicion of insurgency, although he didn't have anything to do with the insurgency at the time. This is about 2004, but he's put into Camp Bucca, which will then become known as a jihadi university because it puts all these individuals who have an axe to grind against the United States for one reason or another, and they start to network with one another. And so Baghdadi seems to be more radicalized after he is released by the United States than he ever was before. And so this is a case of ineffective counterterrorism, counterinsurgency that will just breed more of it.
Yeah, it seems like that happens quite a bit with these sort of measures, which makes sense to me. I mean, like as I'm reading it, I was, I really like the chapter about Sandino a lot. I thought it was really, there are just like so many things that are kind of funny, like how he like called the bald eagle a chicken and just like kind of use some of that language back against the United
Hmm.
States. But I was just thinking, the ways that we sort of just decide, okay, we're going to break the rules because we don't like you. There's no way that that's going to cause people to like us better. Like it just seems like
Right.
such like an obvious conclusion. Like of course they're going to fight harder. Like we all want autonomy, and I think it's really interesting
Yeah.
that we sort of advertise in the United States, kind of like creating this persona of these, quote unquote bad guys, so that people who are reading the news, I guess, support our actions. But I don't, what I don't understand is why sort of the population at large doesn't have like a moment that's sort of like, aha, I too would not want somebody to come into my country and take over my land.
Yeah. Well, I think by using the terminology like bandits and savages and so forth, it blunts kind of national self-reflection by saying, okay, these people like Aguinaldo and Sandino and so forth, these were bandits and savages. They don't know any better, and we have to be more involved. America has to be more involved to protect these people from themselves. And because they're savages, because they're bandits, because they're terrorists, we don't have to take their concerns seriously. And so I think this terminology, and again, I should also preface this by saying, the chapters that I have in here, these aren't also image redemption tours that I'm trying to conduct here for each of these individuals. I'm not by any means suggesting these people weren't so bad or they weren't violent. I'm just trying to point out that the depiction of them had a utility, a usefulness to American imperialism. Um, and it does, and I think to the point that you were making though, is that this language blunts any kind of national self-reflection. Like, wait, why are we in the Philippines? What are we doing? Why are we annexing these islands that are half a world away? Um, when there was a people there that had been fighting against Spanish colonization that had been in place for hundreds of years, and they're on the verge of independence. What what's the United States doing here? And similarly with Nicaragua, why are we getting involved with this? Why are we sending these Marines? Does Sandino have a point here of having these foreign troops in his land? Um, was this really a violation of sovereignty? So these questions are not, I don't think we're generally, at least in the popular discourse, seriously reflected on because they're bandits, they're savages. We don't have to pay attention to them or their concerns.
That makes sense. I was thinking too, though, that like when I was in, so I was in high school around, 9/11 and all that stuff. So, and I was in like a small town in Florida, but there was a huge response to, people did not want us to go to war, even though 9/11 happened. I feel like, I saw like a lot of protests. I mean, there were protests in my town, really big ones, which is weird because it was a really small town, but, and very, very like conservative, like a church on every street corner kind of town. But still, there was like a big enough population of people being like, wait a second, we don't want to send all of our graduating boys to this country. Like, we don't really understand why we're doing this.
Yeah, that really comes about with the Iraq War.
Mhm.
At the time of 9/11, around the world, there are vigils and signs of support globally for the United States, and all of that goodwill is gone in a year and a half when there's the ramp up to the Iraq War. And there's a lot of question about, well, wait a second, why is the United States going to war in Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11, although the Bush administration does have some, they don't come out and say it, but there's some suggestions, some hints. Of course, there's the weapons of mass destruction idea that maybe if Saddam Hussein doesn't use it against the United States, he gives it to a group like Al Qaeda. But the reality is that groups like Al Qaeda hated Saddam Hussein just as much as they did the United States. They had no use for the a secular autocrat like Saddam Hussein. But be that as it may, the uh, um, the Iraq War, I think, really starts to turn people, but not enough. I mean, he gets enough support in Congress. People are okay with it, but I think it's within, 6 to 8 months after the invasion that there's a real turn against what was going on in Iraq, and people started to question, like, what's the United States? What are we doing here? And of course, it's also devastating to the Iraqi people. You have hundreds of thousands of people who will die. Um, and I think even to this day, there's still significant scars in Iraq. Um, and of course, the Iraq War is what will unleash what will become ISIS, which is still out there. Just a couple of weeks ago, credited for staging an attack that killed a couple of Americans in Syria. So it just unleashes all sorts of this stuff.
Was the response against the Iraq War, like, did that happen at any other time in history for any of these other, sort of invasions or mini, battles or anything like that? Or was that sort of a new thing for us as a population to go against it to some degree?
Specifically to the case studies in my book.
Mhm. Or any other,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
I'm interested.
So at least in my book, yeah, there were a couple occasions. The one in the Philippines. There are congressional hearings about the actions of the American military in the Philippines. There are some convictions, but most of them get, a slap on the wrist. Not a whole lot of sanction against the way in which they went about going after some of these Filipinos. But there were questions. There's an anti-imperialist league at the turn of the 20th century that includes famous individuals like Mark Twain, who were very outspoken about the U.S. Filipino War. Uh, so there are some examples of that. Although I think in general the popular mood seems to be supportive of the war, supportive of what the McKinley and then Theodore Roosevelt administrations, how they go after this war. But there is some pushback. Um, and I think similarly in the case of Nicaragua, the longer the U.S. Marine mission there goes on, the more criticism or questioning starts to come about in Congress, but also in the popular press. And also this is the coming at the time of the Great Depression. And there's questions of, well, why is the United States spending any resources whatsoever to stop banditry or so-called banditry in Nicaragua when we have our own problems to deal with at home? Um, and so there is some pressure against on the Hoover administration to try to see to draw down this mission. And it seems like Hoover is only too happy once Nicaragua has its presidential election in late 1932. Hoover is all too ready to bring the rest of the Marines home. They had been drawn down to some extent. Um, so those are two cases in the book where there is some pushback, I think, relative to the kind of pushback you're referring to here on the Iraq War and the global war on terror. So the there is pushback against some of these some of these conflicts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, I was thinking about like the Vietnam War. There was, of course, a lot of a
Yeah,
lot of pushback against that one.
of
Um,
course, yes,
yeah,
that's the big one. Yeah, that's the big
yeah.
one that gets the most pushback.
hmm And I was noticing too that throughout the book, there's this concept of the public enemy number one, which is one of those, phrases that I think is just used so often in the history of our country, particularly in marketing. And I find it to be really interesting how it's used for both people and, concepts like the war on drugs being public enemy number one, and just like this idea of a target that we all need to position ourselves against. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to how that worked in your book and or any thoughts about that in general.
Yeah, so the reason I selected these particular individuals is because I think they all had some significant notoriety in their day as public enemy number one for a variety of reasons. And it started off, thinking about Osama bin Laden in the 21st century. He's one of the most reviled men in American history, with reason, certainly. And so I was trying to think of other individuals, non-state actors specifically. Because when you get into state actors, I think that's a totally different ballgame. So talking like people like, Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, these are heads of state. They had much bigger resources, greater resources at their disposal, different kinds of threats. So that's a different category. But I wanted to focus on non-state actors, private individuals who somehow rose to this position of public enemy number one for one reason or another. And so I came up with these six examples since the turn of the 20th century, because I also tie it into notions of American imperialism, the United States exerting its influence abroad in a much more forceful way than it ever had, prior to, say, 1898. And and these individuals, I think, all rise to this status, and they personify some kind of issue, some kind of concern. Certainly with bin Laden, he's the face of the global war on terror after 9/11. So he kind of personifies this. Um, Pablo Escobar in the 1980s and early 90s, I think he also personifies the longer running war on drugs, which predated him and has continued well after him. But I think there was a time where Pablo Escobar was considered, public enemy number one relative to drugs. Look at Che Guevara in the 1960s. And Che was concerning because he was a vehement anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. He gains a great deal of notoriety and global sympathy for the way in which he would articulate this anti-American sentiment that the United States, particularly the Kennedy and then Johnson administrations, are a little concerned about. And then once he resigns his formal positions in the Cuban government, he gives U.S. a little bit more license to try to find him and pursue him. But basically, what I also have here, I think, is these cases of these individuals as notable uh, public enemies who also represent, I think, a greater threat or concern that Americans had at the time.
That's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought up that these are specifically like these individuals that rose up because I was thinking a lot about scale, and it seems like
Mm.
they're like one person with like a small group kind of initially at least, and the scale of what they do. I mean, I feel like with 9/11 the scale is bigger, but still the scale of what is done initially is much smaller than the US's response to these individuals or small groups. And I find that to be just like extremely compelling. And it also makes me wonder about, like moving forward, just taking these concepts, like knowing this. What do you think? How do you think that this applies to sort of the moments that we are experiencing right now, where I feel like maybe the current public enemies are a little bit more domestic, at least as they are framed by our current government?
Yeah. Yeah, there is a proportionality element to some of this. Certainly with the global war on terror, Al Qaeda has, a couple of hundred maybe pledged members at the time of 9/11. And then the United States is going to embark on this global war on terror that's going to involve missions or training operations in like 80 countries, spending or committing over $8 trillion over the last quarter century to combat this. And even something like, Pancho Villa, he had about 400 members of his militia in the 1910s, and the United States is going to send 7,000 troops after him into the northern Mexican desert. Um, and what's interesting, I find, is that sometimes when the United States is able to, when the United States fails, particularly in the cases of, and sorry, spoilers for anybody who hasn't read the book yet, but with failures and with the mission against Pancho Villa and Augusto Sandino, I think the larger mission is the larger objective is met. But when they do capture or kill some of these other individuals, the broader fight continues. And so that leads me to question the utility of using the military for foreign policy objectives. Um, and it's not that military individuals were failures in the field. It's just to use the military as um, the tip of the spear all the time might not necessarily be the most effective means to combat some of these individuals. And we've been a very kind of military centric, we've had a very military centric foreign policy, particularly since World War II. I mean, you can just look at the um, the defense budgets every year since then. I mean, now we're approaching roughly $1 trillion annually that the United States is spending on defense. And yet, some of these conflicts continue. So I just one of the things I do in the conclusion is to question the effectiveness of using the military as the primary means for counterterrorism operations, and that there could or should be other aspects that could be used. Military could be one, but also to seriously consider the conditions that compel these kinds of individuals abroad who want to do harm to the United States. Well, why? How can we as the United States ameliorate those kinds of conditions? Again, I think the military can be one part of it, but to have a military-centric approach to all these things, um, I question the effectiveness of it.
I think that makes sense. My first husband was in the Navy, and I didn't really know. I mean, when I met him and married him, I had no idea like about anything really other than like my high school and college history classes, right? So, um, but it occurred to me at some point during our marriage that it's kind of weird that we have bases like all over the world. We're like the only
Mhm.
country that has bases like this to the extent that we do all over the world, and they're really, really established. I mean, my dad's father went to Italy when in like the early 50s for several years and was stationed there, and it's like that's just normal to us to have just these families who go and live in these kind of compounds that are just
Yeah.
like we just taken land. And I find it so interesting that that's so normalized, but it's really, I think, kind of unique on the planet. Am I right about that?
I I can't really think of any. I mean, there's nothing that approaches that kind of scale.
Yeah.
If other countries might have bases, and they certainly have military cooperations with other individual countries, but I think last estimate that I saw that the United States had something like 750 military bases around the world. Um, a lot of them stemming from post World War II. So, I mean, the United States still has bases in Germany. You mentioned Italy, South Korea, just, still there to this day. And in many of these cases, I think the countries are okay to some extent of having the United States have a military presence there. Um, and the concern is that if the United States is not there, um, who's going to keep the peace? Who's going to ensure that there is order and stability around the world? And has that worked? I mean, I think if you look at a lot of individual cases around the world, we never had that big apocalyptic, World War III between the United States and the Soviet Union that folks were worried about. No, we didn't have that. But if you look at individual places around the world, there's a huge cost and consequence. I mean, you can go from Angola to Afghanistan, you can go from El Salvador, Guatemala, um, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, all these different places have experienced this kind of violence. Um, and I think we may be or entering a new phase of, well, what's next? Because it seems like the current administration is looking to um, back away from some of those commitments. But the question is, okay, well, what's next? What would be in its place to maintain order and stability in the world? And that has not really been discussed at all. So we'll see what happens. But I do think we are at this inflection point that we have, I think, seen the breaking down of the post World War II international order. So there are remnants of it still around, the military bases, for example, but what will replace it is something that I really haven't seen talked about very much, at least among the current administration. And so we'll see what takes its place.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's very interesting to think about these things as, not necessarily normal, not necessarily a given that like, the community that is experiencing a military base might not like it that much and might have some kind of
Yeah.
reaction to it. And that might be
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah. But it
It's
seems like it's okay if the United States. Can you imagine if China had 750 military bases around the world, or if
yeah.
Russia had if maybe even a tenth of that around the world? How might Americans feel?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, certainly take your point that it doesn't. It's certainly not normal for other countries to do this. And if they did try that, then I think you would certainly see an American response.
It does seem like that. Okay, so we're getting close to time. Back to writing the book. What was that like? How long did it take, and what was the publishing process like?
So this was about an 8 year process for me, from conception to publication. Uh, and the biggest challenge that I think I had in doing this was simply time. So at Nichols, I usually teach 4 classes a semester. So that makes writing during the semester challenging or really impossible, because not only was I teaching 4 classes a semester, I also had administrative responsibilities. I had I have 2 young kids, so that's another aspect of this. So I would basically write about a chapter a year. I was on sabbatical in spring of 2022, so I was able to knock off 2 chapters in that time frame. And my initial conception of this book actually had a couple of additional chapters in the 18th and 19th century. I was initially going to go back to the Indian Wars, the Barbary Pirates, but I jettisoned that for 2 reasons. One, American Indians and the Barbary states were both semi-sovereign people, which didn't quite fit with the non-state actor approach I wanted to do. And then secondly, also I think by keeping it to like a 20th first century time frame, I was able to I think have the imperialism focus a little bit more present. But there was also the practical reason, because if I had to do 2 or 3 more chapters, this is probably another 2 or 3 years to get this book done. So I did shave it down a little bit from the initial conceptions, and I think this is something that happens in the writing process. And in terms of publishing, I was very fortunate to work with Debbie Gershenowitz again. So Debbie was the editor, the acquisitions editor at Cambridge University Press, where I did my first book, America's Forgotten Colony, Cuba's Isle of Pines. And I was thinking about, when I was finishing with that book, I was thinking a little bit about chasing bandits. And I think it was probably a year or so later, I just I had a meeting with her because she was curious, like, hey, what are you going to do next? And so I kind of had this vague description of what I thought this book would be. And she was very receptive, very enthusiastic about the idea. And she said, I would love to see a proposal once you're at that stage. By this point, she had moved on to University of North Carolina Press, which is where who the book is published with. And so I was able to work with her again. She loved the idea, and yeah, and you had it went out to 2 anonymous reviewers who read through it, gave suggestions of how to shore up a couple of questions and to strengthen some other points. So I went through that revision process, and I think with UNC, I think that was probably about 2 years between giving them the initial proposal, getting the feedback, working on revisions, getting additional feedback, and then to publication. So I was basically been working with UNC Press for the last 2 years to get this published, but the writing and publication process, the whole thing took 8 years.
That makes sense. It's kind of validating, just because like some people are like, "Oh, it took me 8 months," and I'm like, "Oh, that's amazing."
I had been I had been asked by a colleague who's not in history or liberal arts, like, well, how many hours do you think you spent on this book? And I'm like, I could not even begin to try to quantify it in terms of hours. I had to think about it in terms of years.
Right. Yeah, totally. And that makes sense. It seems like UNC is really excellent when it comes to the review process. I've heard from a couple different authors with your press, and that's very impressive and good to know, because I think that when, as a reader, if I were not in the publishing world at all, I would probably wonder how that worked. I'm always like flipping to the back to see like what the references are and where they come from.
Yeah.
um, so
Yeah,
it's
and
it's
that was the other
nice.
part of this too. I wanted to make sure I was doing enough research for this because, again, given my time constraints and my other responsibilities, I could not go to archives around the world to do this. So I had to rely on digitized, published primary sources, interlibrary loan, digital newspapers that I could access pretty easily. So a lot of the research that I did was just from my computer. There were I did a couple of research trips to the National Archives in Washington, or College Park, actually. So I did a little bit of that, but it's mostly just, right off of my computer. It's I could access this. So very kind of 21st century, a benefit of the 21st century is to have all these sources digitized, to make sure that I was doing, sufficient research, and my anonymous reviewers, I think were very pleased to see the research that I was able to do for this, to back up the claims that I'm making in the book.
Yeah, definitely. I think that newspapers.com is like an actual like magic resource. Like the amount of newspapers that you can find that are searchable. I was thinking about doing when I did research in like my undergrad, how hard that was to like you
Yeah,
really had to travel and go to like different libraries, even in the early aughts.
yeah,
There just it wasn't like the way it is now, which is just amazing.
yeah. Or or with microfilm, which is kind of, yeah, in between, the stage in between digitized stuff and the printed materials, the microform, which you have to, put in the reel and just kind of scroll through it till your eyes blur. Um, that today, with the, control F function, we can search and find specific terminology, and again, the way I was doing a lot of this research was, well, how were these individuals talked about? And so the rhetoric of it, from the newspapers, the editorials, the opinion pages, but also what politicians were saying at the time. What were they saying? Um, um, that's what I was kind of searching for in a lot of these sources. So, that was, again, one of the benefits of 21st century technology.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that I haven't asked or anything else you want to share about your book before we end today?
I think certainly, as we talked about before, the idea that this is, I wrote this for undergraduates and general readers, but I'm hoping that those who read it kind of see that it's relevant, like right now. Particularly with what's been happening off the coast of Venezuela, with these military strikes against suspected drug runners. A lot of the language that's been used by the administration is the same kinds of stuff that I write about in the book. The term savage has been used, narco-terrorist, terrorist, unlawful combatants. These are
Pirate?
all terms. Yeah, these are all terms that come up in my book. And again, had I been able to spend another year or two on it, what's going on in Venezuela now would probably be the epilogue. But I do think it's extremely relevant, and for folks who want to get a deeper historical sense of the importance of rhetoric relative to what's happening in Venezuela right now, I think my book could speak to that.
That's a really good point. Have you written any companion pieces about that for like any major
I
places?
I did I've done two. So one with Time Magazine's Made by History series over the summer. I did a piece on the use of the rhetoric, particularly against migrants, and how immigrants have been described by the current administration. So I tied that in. So that was something I wrote over the summer. And then I think it's probably about a month ago. I think it's back in November. I wrote something in the Hartford Courant, specifically about the language of the administration on these suspected drug runners, and tying it into chasing bandits. So I have those two pieces that examine the rhetoric and the history of the kind of rhetoric that's been used. Yeah.